evening, everyone out there, and welcome to this program for Necesidad, Immigrant Experiences in Central Oregon. I'm Laurel Westendorf. I'm part of the Community Relations team at the Deschutes Public Library. Every month we explore a theme, and this month's theme is flow. Our two presenters tonight are Lily Bernabe. She is the DACA recipient who has passionately advocated for the Latinx community since she became aware of the injustices they face. Lily is currently enrolled at OSU Cascades, where she plans to pursue a degree in pre-law. She is currently working as a legal assistant for the Public Defender's Office and volunteers as a Spanish medical interpreter during her free time. We also have Kelsey Freeman. She's the author of the nonfiction book No Option But North, The Migrant World, and the Perilous Path Across the Border, which is based on a year of interviewing Central American migrants on their journey north through a Fulbright fellowship. Kelsey has presented and interviewed across the country on immigration policy. She currently works at Central Oregon Community College, where she runs a college readiness program for Native American high school students. Thank you both so much for taking the time tonight to have this discussion on immigration issues in Central Oregon and beyond. We're really happy to have you both.
Thank you so much, Laurel, for having us, and thanks, Lily. And I'm happy to be here with everyone. I want to start just by acknowledging that the land that I am on, I don't know where you all are, but is on Warm Springs and Wasco territory, ceded in the Treaty of 1855. And then the Northern Paiute people later joined or were forced to this area, joining the reservation that's now known as the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs. And then the the Klamath Trail also ran through this area as well. And I say that not to check a box, but just to start us off by thinking about and recognizing that if we're starting to explore the systems of today, we have to realize that we're not divorced from our past. So with that, I'll start off just by sharing a little bit about some of the themes that I found in doing this research that Laurel mentioned for my book, No Option But North. Focusing on why people are migrating, what the journey north looks like. So I'll share my screen. So like Laurel mentioned, my book is called No Option But North, The Migrant World and the Perilous Path Across the Border, based on a year of interviewing Central American migrants on their journey north. And this project began when I was 23. I was on a Fulbright grant in the city called Celaya in the state of Guanajuato. That's right on the path that many migrants, Central American migrants, primarily take north because the train, La Bestia, that snakes through Mexico and that many migrants rely on to get north, bisects the city. So I was there, I was teaching English part-time, I was studying immigration, I spent my evenings in the local migrant shelter. And then I started interviewing migrants. And the more I interviewed, the more I wrote, and the more I wrote, the more pieces there were to this world of migration. So I'd love just to explore a few of those today, and then I'll turn it over to Lily to talk a little bit more about here and now. So the photos in the slideshow that I'll share are all by my sister, Tess Freeman, who's a photojournalist here in Bend. She lives with me, she's downstairs. But she and I collaborated for the last 6 weeks of this project. So she photographed some of the people I interviewed and some scenes. So these photos are all from the book that she took. So as I was doing this research, my central question, what I was looking into, is what it meant to migrate by necessity. And how does migrating by necessity, again, lacking other options, put people in this precarious political position? And how does that change what the journey through Mexico and across the border looks like? So if you lack other options, what does that mean about this journey north? And what I found is that as long as working class Central American and Mexican migrants, which is who I was interviewing, experience forces driving them out, right, that need to migrate, lack sufficient avenues to get to the US, and I'll talk more about that in a minute, and then see an economic demand for their labor in the US, i.e. they're able to sustain their families here, then nothing, no amount of policies that we've seen over the past 4 years will deter people from coming. Instead, we just exacerbate the tragedy that people have to endure to get here. So I'll dig in a little bit to each of these points, but I also want to point out that there are a multitude of different experiences about what it means to migrate. And I'm just sharing a few general trends from what I heard talking to, you know, hundreds of migrants over the course of 9 months. So this is not everybody's story or everybody's experiences by any means. So I just wanted to put that out there. So I started out in my interviews by asking people, why they were leaving, and if they had other options. And everyone I talked to said they felt they were migrating by necessity. That is, walking or riding their way north was their last option. They didn't necessarily want to be on this path, but it felt like the only way forward. So, the main reasons people were migrating were pretty what you might imagine, family. I talked to a lot of parents of US citizen kids that were trying to get back to their kids. They were unwilling to accept the reality, as most of us would, of living apart from their families, separated by a border. So I talked to people who were trying for the 5th or 6th or 7th time even to get across the border. And they said to me, I'm going to keep trying. I'm going to keep trying until I'm able to get back to my kids. Then there's economic opportunity, right? This is a huge reason why a lot of people migrate. And I think it's pretty simple when you break it down, because if you are living in a place where there is a profound lack of economic opportunity, right? There just aren't jobs available, or the jobs that are available, there's no way to sustain a family on those wages. And you could head north and make in an hour what might take weeks to earn back home if you can find the work. Then people do what they need to do in order to provide for their families. I talked to a lot of people who said, my kids eat, they need clothes, I want to send them to school. And they felt like the only way to progress economically was to head north. Again, we're talking about profound lack of economic opportunity across much of the Northern Triangle, that is Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and in a lot of Mexico. So there just aren't the jobs available. And then this growing reason why a lot of people are migrating: cartel and gang violence. And unfortunately, our national narrative over the past 4 years has really conflated the people fleeing gang violence with the people perpetrating gang violence, which is not the case at all. I talked to so many people who were everyday citizens just trying to live their lives, but found themselves caught up in the tentacles of organized crime, not wanting to be at all. So I want to emphasize that, it's not that everywhere in Mexico is dangerous, right, by any stretch. It's not that everywhere in the Northern Triangle is dangerous. But there are places where organized crime has really entrenched itself. And what happens when this takes place is that it becomes very difficult for ordinary people to live their lives, Police, politicians, media all become in the back pocket of gangs or cartels. Industry gets controlled in the sense that, for instance, I talked to a lot of business owners who, they had their business at home, and it's very ubiquitous for the local cartel or gang to charge a tax to that business simply for existing. And so what happens if you can no longer pay that tax to this organized crime unit? Well, you come under threat, your life is all of a sudden in danger. What do? People flee, because what other option remains? And sometimes economic opportunity and gang violence are really intricately interlinked. For instance, I talked to this one family, Ernesto and Jackie, who I'll talk more about later, but Ernesto told me, you know, he and his wife worked on the coffee plantation in El Salvador in their hometown, the only real way to make a living. But then the price of coffee fell and the plantation cut a lot of jobs. And he said, well, at least in the old days, I could go to the city and work, or I could go to another area to find work within El Salvador. But now he says that's not possible because the town where I live is one gang's territory, and the town that I would go to work is another gang's. Just because I live in one territory, I can't go into another gang's territory anymore. Again, having nothing to do with the gang or cartel, but gangs in this way have created these artificial boundaries where they control the movements of everyday citizens, making it impossible to earn a living wage, even if you can move around within El Salvador. So Ernesto felt that the only way to make a living, to sustain his family, was to head north. And so if we think about these reasons and how they pile up to these situations where people feel like they are migrating by necessity, then what options are available? I started this project when I was traveling, I was studying abroad, I was doing research for my undergraduate thesis, and I had this conversation with the man next to me in the bus who asked me, how is it that you from the US can come to my country, that is Mexico, we were in Mexico, to do research for 2 weeks while I've been repeatedly denied for a visa to go back and visit my family in your country? And that question stuck with me. How could it not? It caused me to want to dig deeper into how is it that nationality and race and class all play a role in who gets to come to the US, through visa systems, etc., and who has to undergo this perilous journey north instead out of necessity. So digging into kind of what avenues exist, it really is a privilege to have an access to a visa to come to the US. Most people, when you hear this refrain of, well, why can't people just get in line? I've heard that a lot, and it's infuriating for a lot of reasons, but also because there's no line to get in for the majority of people who come here. There are very few avenues to enter the US. These are kind of some of the main principal avenues. If you have a family member, direct family member that has permanent legal status or is a citizen, they can sponsor you through a long process. If you already have a job in the US, your employer can sponsor your work visa, but these visas are typically for specialty skilled workers. You can apply for political asylum based on the grounds that you're fleeing persecution in your home country. I'll dig into that more in a second. Or you can apply for something called the Diversity Visa Lottery, which is 50,000 currently, 50,000 annual visas that go towards countries that tend to send less migrants to the US, so excluding Mexico, Guatemala, among others. And these are the main avenues. So what I found in digging deeper into this research for my book, No Option But North, is that this experience of trying to get to the US is not the same if you're applying from Mexico versus if you're applying from France, let's say. And that's because, again, nationality, class, and race all matter in who gets to come to the US. I want to spend just a couple minutes digging into this a little bit because one of the goals of my book is to connect the structural issues, the policies and practices with people's lived realities. So what are our policies that create these situations? Well, our immigration system is structured around country quotas still. So we work under this system where no country can receive more than 7% of total US visas in any given category. So each country, no one can monopolize the visa system, let's say. But what that does is for a country like Mexico, whose visa applicants made up over a quarter of worldwide applicants, that creates or disproportionately strains the system for those applying for Mexico. So let's take a look at what this looks like for just a second. So in March of 2019, this is one example, the State Department was processing high priority visa requests for children of US citizens. So children of US citizens who have that avenue into the country, they're processing those requests. And they're backlogged across the board, so they're processing requests filed in October 2011. But these same visas, that is children of US citizens from Mexico, were so backlogged that the State Department was still processing requests that were filed in 1997. So these applicants, who again had this way into the country, were waiting 22 years for their visa to even be considered, and they were waiting a full 14 years longer than people from most other countries. So this system is not, equal across nationality. And race plays an important role in this as well, because if we break down which countries tend to experience these disproportionate backlogs, they are disproportionately non-white countries, non-European countries, Western European countries. So again, it's people of color that are disproportionately experiencing these backlogs. And class matters in a really important way as well. We actually have something called the public charge exclusion, which has been a feature of immigration policy for decades, that allows, allows consular officers or the State Department to deny a visa or a request for a green card based on the grounds that someone might become a public charge. That is, rely on public assistance for their livelihood. That's not a formulaic process by any means. And it relies on this idea that, okay, if you're poor at home, you're gonna continue to be poor in the US, and we're not gonna give you that chance, right? So that can be, people can be denied based on the public charge exclusion. But this has gained recent attention because the Trump administration has changed the definition of public charge such that it now includes anyone who has received public benefits or is deemed likely to receive public benefits for more than 12 months. And what this does is it creates tremendous fear here in the US. It creates tremendous fear among our immigrant communities, because who knows what counts as a public charge? I don't even fully know. Immigrant communities are asking, well, do my US citizen kids, parents might be asking, do my US citizen kids receiving free and reduced lunch, is that gonna disqualify me later on? Is receiving a COVID test going to be an issue? A COVID vaccine? Now, the government has clarified that no, you can get your vaccine, your test, etc. But that information is not getting out, and there's not that trust there, understandably so, because this has been a policy to create fear. I'll just unpacking one of the other main avenues to get to the US, again, is through political asylum. So becoming a refugee based on the grounds that you're fleeing persecution in your home country. But the issue here is that the majority of people from the Northern Triangle, from Central America, and from Mexico lose their asylum cases. And that's because it's very difficult to fit the definition of a refugee when you're fleeing gang violence. So to qualify, someone has to be fleeing persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group, as it's called. So it's hard to prove that, yes, this gang member persecuted me because of my religion. Oftentimes it's not that straightforward. So it's not a avenue to flee. If you're, I talked to many people who were fleeing for their lives, but political asylum seemed not to be a viable option for them. And then I won't go through all of this. This slide is deliberately dense because there have been so many asylum restrictions under the Trump administration. There was the Migrant Protection Protocols, as it was called, also known as Remain in Mexico, where those seeking asylum were forced to wait in Mexico while their cases went through the asylum courts, leaving them still vulnerable to the organized crime that they were fleeing in the first place. That has recently been rescinded. There was something called the Third Country Transit Asylum Ban that meant that those who transited through another country before the US had to apply for asylum in that country first and be denied. So Central Americans coming through Mexico would have to apply for asylum in Mexico, which relies on this idea that somehow Central Americans are just as safe in Mexico as they would be in the US, which is certainly not the case. So over the last 4 years, we've seen this systematic erosion of the asylum process, which I think has been, parallels what we've seen overall in terms of the Trump administration's approach to immigration policy. He has tried to restrict avenues for legal migration, like asylum, and make it so much more difficult and cumbersome to be able to get to the US, putting up a wall, not that that does anything, but putting up a wall, separating children from their families, restricting asylum, all these different things aimed at deterring migrants that do not deter migrants, but again, just up the tragedy they endure to get here. So if you're migrating by necessity, there's no line to get in and no avenue to come to the US, then what the majority of people do is they take on this incredibly violent journey north. So I'll spend a few minutes just unpacking what that looks like. Again, I was talking primarily to Central American migrants. And for Central American migrants, the minute they step into Mexico, they become vulnerable. And that is because oftentimes they're carrying all their cash on them. They are not, aren't armed or have any way to defend themselves. And they're transiting through really isolated areas because they're trying to avoid the authorities, trying to avoid getting detained and deported. So they're transiting through these really isolated areas where they're rendered extremely vulnerable to organized crime. The majority of people that I talked to had been assaulted, beaten, robbed, sexually assaulted. I talked to, a number of people that had been sexually assaulted. And I talked to people that had been kidnapped too on the journey north. So who are these, as Central Americans are navigating this web of violence to get to the US, where these perils become increasingly common, who are targeting migrants? Why is this happening? Oftentimes it comes from Mexico's immigration patrol, Instituto Nacional de Migración itself, and the federal police, who can be prone to corruption. Random criminals that take advantage of migrants when they transit through isolated areas. Los Zetas and other drug cartels that unfortunately have made targeting migrants an entire industry. And then there's also private security guards that get hired by the train companies, whose sole job is to knock migrants off the train, which oftentimes means beating them as well. So one of the increasing perils of this journey is kidnapping. cartels will again have made this whole warped business model where they'll kidnap migrants in mass, 100 migrants at a time from the train, let's say, hold them in houses until their family in the US pays ransom, which is, another kind of tentacle of their illicit business industry. So this woman in this photo, her name was Rosara, and she was kind of stuck in Celaya because her husband, who she was traveling with, had been kidnapped in Celaya. And so she was stuck. She was grieving. She was trying to figure out what to do next. She was reporting the crime, actually, and trying to see if anything would be done about it. But she didn't know what to do. She tried to look for work in Celaya without much luck. She thought about going home, but she fled Guatemala City in the first place because her brother had been disappeared by cartels, kidnapped, and no one knew what happened by him or to him. And then her and her husband began to receive threats, so they headed north. But she also didn't feel like she could continue this journey alone as a woman. As I mentioned, sexual assault and rape are tragically common parts of this story too, because there's estimates that anywhere between 60 and 80% of the women that attempt this journey experience some form of sexual violence on the way. That's astounding. That's the majority. I talked to many women who were taking birth control, literally preparing for the possibility of experiencing this life-altering trauma. And I think this points to a fundamental truth about this journey, is that if people are knowingly preparing for this type of violence to get to the US, there's a reason, right? It points to the fact that there's greater suffering at home. And so as people continue on, the journey in and of itself becomes a form of violence as well. I mentioned La Bestia, which is the beast. It's what migrants call the freight train that snaked through Mexico, that many Central Americans rely on to head north. Most Mexican migrants will take the bus to the border and cross. But because Central American migrants are trying to avoid Mexican authorities, they're taking the train and trying to remain in the shadows, so to speak. So this process of taking the train in and of itself is a form of violence. Think about running, some migrants will take the train when it's stopped, but others don't have that luxury. It won't stop. So they run alongside the train, moving 20 or more miles an hour, trying to time their gait to the relentless pounding of this freight train, waiting for the moment where then they can leap and try and grab the rungs and climb on top. And so I, spoke to people who had seen others die falling from the train, getting crushed below. I met people who had lost limbs falling themselves. So I think about all this kind of accumulated violence, right? And what it says about this, again, what it means to flee by necessity, what it means to take on this violence. And the last kind of story I'll share is just, maybe I'll read a short segment from the book here. But this is Jocelyn and Maria, who are the two little girls of the couple I mentioned earlier, Jackie and Ernesto. And Jackie was traveling, with her two little girls, and she was also 8 months pregnant. And they traveled by the La Bestia, the freight train. So I'll read just a short segment getting at this theme of the accumulated weight of this journey, especially for kids. So again, this family is traveling by freight train. Ernesto described one night when it was pouring rain and they had nowhere to sleep. The girls were soaked through their pink sweatshirts. Eventually, the family came across an old abandoned car. Crawling underneath, they spent the night there, the raindrops percolating through the rust and plastering their foreheads. Yo estaba temblando, Jocelyn, the oldest daughter, suddenly interjected. I was trembling. I had been unaware that she had been listening to the conversation. I pictured 6-year-old Jocelyn sleeping under a rusty car in the rain and wondered what her innocent mind made of what she had already been through. 6 is old enough to comprehend that the life you are living is transitory. 6 is old enough to grasp that there are certain evils that even your parents can't shield you from. The rain hits your face and they can't keep you warm. At 6, you recognize that it feels scary to grab the rungs of a freight train, but you're not old enough to understand why you're doing it. You carry all the emotions of the world inside you, but none of the logic. So that just kind of is a short portion to, again, to think about what is the accumulated weight of this journey. Going back to the beginning, being in this precarious political position where our policies don't permit people to, be with their families. Instead, we separate them by borders. What is the accumulated weight of our policies? And so just to kind of wrap up, in 9 months of speaking with hundreds of migrants, I think the biggest thing I came away with was really respect, right? Respect for people that overcome the systemic obstacles, that respect for people that are willing to risk their lives to feed their families, right? To send their kids to school. I believe wholeheartedly in the power of story. I believe in stories that expose violence, but that really get at people's essential dignity as human beings. And so that's what I hope, people take away from my book. I hope that's what people walk away with. I hope that people walk away with some sense of that tonight. Because I think, too, if we can understand and see and name the policies that put people in these situations where they're making choices that aren't really choices at all, then we have a stake in changing those policies too. I think when I'm thinking about this work and I'm thinking about speaking out about immigration policy, I think one of my essential roles is to give voice to the structural injustices and inadequacies that render these stories possible in the first place. So thinking about the policies, thinking about our choices here in the US. So I hope that people take that away as well. And so I'll go ahead and stop sharing here. And then I will, here we are. And then I'll turn it over to Lily to talk a little bit more and share a little bit more about her story here in Central Oregon.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Lily Bernabe. I have been living in Central Oregon for quite a while now. I think it's been about, 10 years or so, a little longer. And I am from Mexico, from Guadalajara, where, I was there for about 5 years, and that is when my parents decided, like the title of this presentation, that we had to leave Mexico por necesidad. And aside from that, they don't only say their decision had to do with necessity, but also for us to have a better future. So they decided to cross the border along with my sister and my brother and I. My dad crossed the border through the desert. It was a 3-day trip. He almost lost his life and almost got caught by Custom and Border Patrol. My mother crossed the border through the line, and everything went well with her. She was actually caught once at the border and had to head back down to Guadalajara and try to cross the border once again. She said she paid the smuggler about $5,000. This was back in 2001. So if you were, wondering, now I think it's about 15,000, possibly even more. So me, I like to flaunt that I crossed the border on my own at the age of 5, which is kind of true. So my mother gave me to someone else who would cross me over. So she regrets it now, and she really, really regrets doing that because she didn't know the person who she gave me to, just the person who had said, hey, I know this lady who will cross the girl and your daughter, and she'll be there within 2 days. So my parents paid for me to cross the border. I remember I was on a cab or a taxi, because I remember it was yellow and it had the word taxi in black printed on it. And I remember sitting in the back of the car, in the passenger seat, the back of the car, and I remember the person driving that vehicle asking me to be very quiet. So my mom, and that's all I remember, my mom will say, that is not true, honey. You are crazy. That's not how you crossed. And I always ask, well, how do you know that? You weren't there. And all she says is, mothers know everything. So how can I argue with that? So, but that's how I remember it. And that's how I always tell it. And then we moved to California, and that's where I kind of grew up. I remember being young and my parents working in the fields, the hot fields of California. And they used to take us as well, my 2 siblings and I, and we would help them through the summer. So I didn't have like a normal, summer vacation where I would go on vacation. It was more, go to the fields and help your parents, because the more they pick, the more they earn. And poverty is a big thing. And, I understand when there is need, and it was fun for me. But now that I think about it, a 6-year-old shouldn't be out picking strawberries. And so, but it was fun, and it taught me a lot. And then we moved to Oregon, to Central Oregon here in Bend, and I have been living here since. And then in 2012, DACA became a reality for dreamers. That included myself. And it changed my life. So before DACA, I'm sure you guys have heard the term of living in the shadows. And that is what it feels like. And why does it feel that way? It feels that way because you feel like you have to hide who you truly are in order to be accepted, in order to not put your family at risk, and in order for your own safety, basically. So I'll give you an example. All teenagers are excited about driving cars and getting their driver's license at a certain age. Well, I was still not I was still undocumented when I was, I got to the age where driving became a thing for me, but I couldn't get my driver's license. And I had, my friends asking me, oh, I just got my driver's license. When are you getting yours? And, it was like, oh yeah, well, it was always constant excuses, for them to not be asking me. And always fearing, that fear of coming home and not finding your parents, or your parents not being there. Something that, a normal teenager doesn't have to worry about, or, a young kid. So, living in constant fear. And not that that fear doesn't exist anymore, because it's still there, but you learn to control it and learn to not let it, rule your life. But before, ICE was a huge thing. It's still a huge thing. It was in our small town, 6 months ago. And it's very difficult. So living as an immigrant in the United States is very difficult. I mean, there are a ton of privileges that we have here that we, might have not had in our country, or, it would have been harder for us to get those privileges in our country. But it just costs a lot to live undocumented. And people always ask, well, why don't you do it the right way? Well, I wish I could, why wouldn't I? I would be the first one in line if there was a line, because no one likes to live in the shadows or live, undocumented. And so back to DACA, it became a thing in 2012, and it has changed my life. I was able to get a driver's license. My parents didn't have driver's licenses, so it was on me, taking them. Of course, they did it before, where they had to drive because there was no way out of it. I wasn't always available, and until this year, when now that driver's licenses are available for undocumented citizens, I was my parents' go-to, as well as my sister and my brother, who we are all adults, and that's why we stick around, and I could have gone across the country to a nice school, another institution, but I decided to stay in town because my parents need me here, and I want to make sure that they're okay. So that's another thing about, DACA. It gives you big responsibilities with your family. Aside from that, I was able to get a job legally with a social security number and have a worker's permit as well. I have to renew it every 2 years, and the fee for it is $495 for the application, aside from attorney fees and anything that comes along, with the permit. You also have to go through an extensive background check to make sure that you haven't gotten into trouble and that you are an exemplary citizen And if you can't meet those standards, you are denied. So I've been under the protection of DACA for 7 years now, 7 years. And it has allowed me to pursue my education. It has given me a wonderful job. And it also comes with a lot of stress as well, because every 2 years, and then Donald Trump decided to rescind it on September 7th or September 4th. I can't remember, but it was a while back. And that's when I felt like my doors were closing, and it was scary because I had thought about moving back to Mexico. You know, I said, I have an education now. I am bilingual. I can probably do this. I can probably do that. All these things, right? But I don't know Mexico. So I can say I'm from Mexico because that's my nationality, but I've never grown up, you know, I didn't grow up in Mexico and never really got to see, you know, what life was like in Mexico. So I decided to hold off because I had already packed my things. I was like, I'm leaving. I can't live under the pressure of not knowing what's going to happen with DACA tomorrow, not knowing if I'm going to have to quit my job, quit school, you know, move because USCIS has all my information. So it became scary at one point. And I remember reading a wonderful book by a Mexican reporter, Jorge Ramos, and it's titled Stranger. And in there, he talks about how we all constructed this country and how we are all responsible for the growth and the economic success and diversity of this country, and how we can't just give up on our American dream because someone looks at us in a weird way, someone talks about us in a degrading way, or someone doesn't want us here. So I thought about that and said, you know what? He's right. Why do I have to give up on a dream that my parents fought so hard for and risked their life? So here I am, 3 years later. I am close to graduating from OSU Cascades, and it has been a wonderful journey. It has been very difficult. But being an undocumented immigrant has taught me that you need to work harder for everything. You know, you need to work harder and you need to prove yourself more than just the average person. And I remember as well, I always think these talks get easier because I've done them several times now, but it always makes me want to cry. But I remember a colleague of mine who presented with me once, who said that her father always tells her, people can take anything from you, but they can't take your education. And that has stuck with me. And that's just something that I think is important, because education means everything. And my parents always told me since I was small, you know, you're going to be an attorney and you're going to fight for people like us. But I never understood what people like us meant until now, until I was able to fight for driver's licenses for all, which became a law earlier this year. Actually, my parents already have their driver's license, and you know, they're driving legally, and it's amazing to be able to speak up, you know. And people, I would always hear my parents say, well, we don't have a voice, we have to do what the law says, we can't you know, fight for our rights because we're not here legally. You know, we have to live in the shadows, and we can't speak up about the injustices that we live. Well, no, you know, now that I'm older, I realize that that's not true, because we have a right to life, whether, you know, whether we are legal or not. No one is illegal. Like, it's just a very degrading term, as well as alien. And I saw that Biden wants to get rid of that term, and I'm very happy, I have to tell you, because I don't look like an alien, right? Even if it has another meaning in the American dictionary or in the English dictionary, excuse me, like I don't look like an alien. But it's been a great journey, and I'm very grateful, to hear Kelsey's side of the story, because I didn't get to live through those awful things, and I am privileged for that. I am privileged that I didn't have to go through such things, and that I am here and I am safe. And I think I'm sure you guys saw it, and I wanted to mention it tonight, but Ted Cruz crossed the border to take his kids to Mexico because they just needed a break and they didn't have electricity or stuff like that. As you can see, people are willing to go long ways for the safety of their families. And something as simple as that, America is one of the richest countries, and to have to fly to Mexico in order to find shelter and electricity and running water, it's a big thing, because we know Mexico, it's a pretty poor country. But anyway, I want to thank you guys for being here tonight with Kelsey and I. And I just wanted to put a face to the name, right? Undocumented citizen, undocumented immigrant, whatever you want to call it. This is us. We're not rapists. We're not, not all of us. We're people, just like the rest. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you, Laurel. Thank you, Kelsey. And thank you, everyone, for being here with us tonight. And I think we're going to open it up for questions, right, Laurel?
Yes, if you in the audience have questions, please put them in the Q&A. We have a lot of thank you for sharing your story. Your voice is powerful. And I do want to thank you, especially Lily. It is not only brave, but also just exposing how you're feeling to a bunch of people that don't know. And I do want to thank you. One of the questions we have, let's see, how many blatant misunderstandings there are of how the system works, the cost of DACA, of getting a visa, the lack of options of coming over legally, to not allow people fleeing gang violence to get in legally, the suffering that spurs people on to come over, confusing those perpetuating violence with those fleeing violence. I just want to ask you both, how those barriers of those real profound misunderstandings, how those can be broken down, maybe how you've seen them broken down, to get people to understand. And I think avenues like this, where people talk about it, is definitely one of them. But if you want to talk about other ways that confusion can be dispelled.
Well, I think getting people to question what they think they know about our immigration system. Immigration is incredibly complicated. Immigration policy, it has grown increasingly complicated over the past 4 years, as I mentioned, as the Trump administration has really, has issued over 300 executive orders on immigration. So I think, that's a lot for the public to keep track of, but I think if we can break it down into understanding what it actually takes to immigrate to the US, what avenues are available and what avenues are not available for the majority of people, then it starts to dispel this myth that somehow, people aren't doing it the right way, as if there were a right way available. So as I said at the end of kind of my piece, is I believe wholeheartedly in the power of forums like this, the power of stories, because I think they have the power to spur political action. If you understand that how much a driver's license can make a difference, right? then maybe you're more inclined to vote for a policy that makes something like that possible. So I think breaking down these myths so that we can actually vote and speak up where our hearts lie.
Definitely, I would agree. The immigration is a very contentious and polarizing subject, and I think this hearing individual stories is really powerful and helpful. Let's see, trying to get one of the questions here. Understanding that question. Let's see, Lily, if you would, I know you talked about the experience of your driver's license and having to come up with, a story for your friends, which is so illuminating, about the conflict, this milestone that was taken from you, and someone is asking what your experience in the Bend schools was like as an undocumented student. If you feel like talking about that.
Definitely. So I became a student for I think it was So back in 2005 when we moved to Oregon, I became a student at Jewel Elementary School. So that's where I started. And my experience was wonderful. I think it was wonderful, and it all had to do with Mary Becker. She was a ELL teacher, so English language learner, or ESL, English as a second language student, or teacher, and she was very supportive. But I remember it being very, very difficult for my mom to communicate with teachers, to communicate with faculty members on, what I needed in order to be successful. So I was thrown into an ESL class without my mom being notified of it. And all that they determined this through an exam, a literacy exam that I had to take. And I was thrown into ESL, was pulled out of class, which now, I remember my sister kind of had the same situation. And I remember her mentioning that she felt like she had lost so much time or learning opportunities because she was pulled out into an ESL class. And I'm not saying that those ESL classes don't help, because they were very, very, very supportive and just wonderful. But I feel like we would have learned probably a lot more if we were to have been left in the school, or in the class, and not have to be taken out during science class, or during the art class, or during, it was always at a different time, so it wasn't a specific time, which made it very difficult. So I think that the ESL classes are somewhat helpful, but at the same time, it kind of robs the student of the opportunity to learn equally alongside the other students who don't have, the language barrier. I also remember being part of several reading programs. I remember being called a sparrow reader. So they had like the eagles and then the sparrows, right? The eagles were like the very good readers. And I remember being a sparrow along with three other students who looked like me. And there was another student as well who had a learning disability, who was in our group. So, just stuff like that. And it kind of singles you out, which makes you think that you are not learning the way that they want you to, or you're behind on something. I am also an interpreter for the school district. So I've also gotten to see well, aside from elementary school, I was in ESL all through middle school and half of high school. And I like I said, I think it was helpful, but it took that opportunity from me. And since it was mandatory for me to be an ESL, it made it very hard for me to get out of it and choose an elective instead of having to take ESL. But now as an interpreter, I am more aware of kind of like the situation that's going on with students, Latinx students in particular, who want to drop out of school, feel like they're not being listened to, feel like English isn't their thing, feel like these standardized tests are just a hassle, because that's where I was at, you know, these standardized tests that make you feel stupid to some extent, because the reading in there is just so, you know, descriptive. And sometimes you, as a second language learner, or as a English language learner, for example, for me, I have to translate things into my native language in order to understand them sometimes. So when you're timed, it makes it very difficult to, you know, reach the expectations of these standardized exams. So yeah, I mean, that was kind of like, those two were like the biggest struggles with school.
And we had, let's see, you know, Lily, what are some helpful actions other than probably voting that documented allies can take to make you feel like you're an important part of this country and community?
I think education more than anything. I think educating yourself on the, you know, things like this panel, you know, like just going out there and educating yourself on what the needs of the communities are. So Kelsey mentioned it, and I didn't interrupt you, Kelsey, because I thought it was disrespectful, but let me just add the public charge. You talked about public charge, and I do want to mention on that, you probably heard, you know, that Latinos were hit at a much higher rate by COVID than other races. And it didn't only have to do with the fact that they earn so little as agricultural workers, as restaurant employees, as, you know, it also had to do with public charge. I'm a medical interpreter as well, and I heard it several times. Patients asking us, is this gonna be marked as public charge if St. Charles gives me money to help me pay, you know, financial assistance? If I fill out this financial assistance form, is this public charge? People didn't want to go to the hospital because of these things, didn't want to visit their doctor's offices, so take their kids in. So, you know, when you have that fear, sometimes that fear is stronger than, you know, your own safety. So, I mean, in my mind, you know, I'd be like, well, why are you worried about this right now when you could possibly die from this? But when you sit down and think about it, there are also a lot of things that you have to, you know, that are on the line. And sometimes people might think that it's not worth a quick visit to their freedom or their citizenship or whatever it is, isn't worth, you know, their health, or that it's more important. It's just frustrating, but yeah, so public charge really put fear in our communities. So just learning about, you know, other policies that affect undocumented immigrants, like on the ballot last term, we had, what was it? I can't remember what it was, but it was, I think 105. It was Say No to 105. But making Oregon not be a sanctuary city and having law enforcement work with immigration officials to arrest or try to arrest undocumented immigrants. So that's the racial profiling right there, right? So just being well educated, especially, with voting and saying, like, just thinking on how certain things affect communities, or underrepresented communities. I think that's the most important thing, as well as donating to like LCA and Volunteers in Medicine, which is a nonprofit organization that helps people who don't have health insurance to access free healthcare. So yeah, I volunteer for them. So if you want their information, let me know.
And the LCA is the Latino Community Association.
Oh yeah, yes.
Wonderful. And Kelsey, I think that you had a slide that was a reference to, solutions to immigration, or, what can be done. And I was wondering if you could possibly share that. And I think we've run out of time. I really appreciate all the questions coming in, but I do want to be respectful of both Lily and Kelsey's time. So.
Sure, I'm happy to share that. I think a lot about policy, because these are issues created by policy, as I mentioned. I also that's what I study. So, but so in terms of this, I'll share my, again, incredibly dense, purposefully dense slide that talks a little bit about, okay, so there are all these issues, right? What do we do about it? So there's a lot in there, but I'll leave that up. And then there's, the U.S. Citizenship Act of 2021 was just introduced. That is not a fix-all solution, but would provide a pathway for many undocumented immigrants over the course of 8 years, which is a long time, but again, providing that option. So that's, an option too, to call your senators and call your representatives on. I think the biggest thing is we need to dramatically expand legal immigration pathways and pathways to citizenship, so that there is that option. The need is not going to go away. We, have to make our policies reflect the current realities of the time, and treat people like human beings, right?
I do want to thank you both so much for taking the time to talk with us tonight, and, just to hear what's at stake in the dignity inherent in all human beings. It's good to hear, and stand for that. So for those of you in the audience, we have so many programs at the Deschutes Public Library that are all educational, free, and virtual. I encourage you to check them out. We have a YouTube channel, as well as going to DeschutesLibrary.org/calendar for upcoming programs, which we have a lot of really good ones coming up, and then recordings of programs. And I hope all of you have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you again, Lily and Kelsey.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.